And yet, simultaneously, they brought peace to the whole known world, called the Pax Romana, and the Roman roads. And they brought aqueducts into the areas that brought fresh water in. They introduced science and technology that other places didn't have. If this had not happened, it's really weird to think about that a conquering, barbaric, in one sense, regime, Rome, that conquered and did so by rape and murder to force people to submit, but in that aftermath, those communities are now connected in ways that they never would have been before. In fact, I remember in Bible college having to write a paper on the reality of the Roman roads. They built roads throughout all of the Roman Empire. You remember being taught in history class, all roads lead to Rome? You remember that? The reason for that is that they built the roads from Rome out into the empire, and those roads made it possible for quick and easy travel so that the apostles, after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, have Roman roads to spread the gospel in a way that they would not have been able to do 500 years prior. There's just one thing to throw out. Jesus is saying, he is implicitly saying, by saying, give to Caesar, the guy on this coin, and it was understood that if an emperor minted the coin, he is the owner of that coin, he's the sovereign over that empire, and therefore we as provincial governments underneath of him owe him a tribute tax. Give to him what is due him. So he is acknowledging the right of obeying a governing authority. In this case, an odious governing authority. This is the Brussels sprout part of my sermon. So, let me just tell you that we're going to talk about obeying the government, and then we're going to come back to Jesus, okay? But Jesus here, he says it, give to Caesar, with this filthy inscription that says he's the son of the divine Augustus. Give to him what is due him. In other words, pay this tax. Let's go to Romans chapter 13. I'm just going to read the first 7 verses. Let every person, this is Paul, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. At this point, about 40 years after this moment in the temple, the Roman government is worse than Jesus' day. And they're on the verge, and in some places already engaged in massive persecution. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. I want you just to think then that governments have been instituted by God. And here's the purpose. Let's keep reading. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct. At least they're not supposed to be. Okay, that's in my opinion. They're not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he, the government authority, the magistrate, whoever it is, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience, your mind and your heart. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. So, the way that I would look at this is if you can picture God at the top, and underneath of Him, like a big umbrella, underneath of Him, God institutes governments all over the world, not just ours. He institutes governments all over the world. And these governments are, according to this, ministers of God to, in a civil sense, keep cultures and societies from descending into chaos. Because without some kind of government structure, we do go into chaos. When we were in Haiti, some of you, I think, were there. One of the things that struck me was their government had collapsed and the UN was there. Because without that presence, people would start killing each other. They were killing each other anyway after that earthquake is when we were there. But without a government presence of some kind, people descend into chaos. We complain a lot about authoritarian structures. I am the chiefest of sinners in this room. But without some of these structures, the chaos that would ensue, you would be begging for the corrupt government to come back. Now, what the Bible is telling us, what Romans 13 is telling us, is that God is over that authority. And then under that authority would be us. So even though he's talking about Caligula and Nero and other horrific leaders, people that lit up the Roman Colosseum with Christians crucified all the way around the arena, covered in pitch and lit on fire, submit to a government that represents corruption to that degree. Because they're ministers of God, but anytime that this umbrella structure, God institutes the authority and we are to obey the authority because it's coming from God, anytime that authority goes out from under that umbrella and says, here are some things that you are going to do that are directly in violation to this authority, at that point, no, you are not to obey the government. If they tell us we can't worship, if they tell you you must support certain causes that involve LGBTQ lifestyles or whatever it would be, that's the big thing that we live in, what we deal with right now. If we say no, because God is the ultimate authority, and when I read this, I realize that these governments that are instituted by God as a common grace, that they have a responsibility under God. Part of the role of the church is to remind governments of that responsibility. Now that is another sermon, okay, that I am not going to try to do this morning. But the church is supposed to have a prophetic voice that calls the government to task to say, you have a responsibility to execute justice because you have been appointed by God to do so, and you are not doing it. You have a responsibility that you are failing at. So that is another sermon, and it gets a little gray because there are different interpretations. Just as a side note of where this gray area is, verse 2 says, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. So that means the American Revolutionary War was sin. Or does it? I don't think that it does mean claim that I have the answer. But I'm just going to tell you that historically throughout Christian thought, with these verses in mind, not trying to ignore them, but with these verses in mind, there were very godly men in the 1700s who said, we need our own nation because of the tyranny of that one that's subjecting us. So, I'm not going to try to answer all those questions this morning. I'm just letting you know that there is a lot to take in. But what we can take in this morning for our Brussels sprouts in the sermon is that we are to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, pay what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Even knowing that my tax dollars and yours are wasted in some of the most egregious ways imaginable. Just unbelievable excess and waste. And that's just talking about bad stewardship, let alone going into programs that are diametrically opposed to a Christian worldview. And that was happening then too. Because the Roman Empire was doing the same thing. In fact, if there's one thing we know about governments and power, and it goes, Aristotle even talked about it before this even, but Aristotle's like 200 years before Jesus. The idea is that if people are in power, the power goes to their head, and it goes to their pocketbooks, it goes to their pleasures. People in power, once they've got it, they want to stay in power, and then they want to use the power to do what power does, which is, this is what I want, gimme, gimme, gimme. This is what I need, give me, gimme, gimme. And then you're going to pay for it, or you're going to let me do it, or you're going to shut up because I'm in power. That is what power always does, and Thomas Jefferson said, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who said that the power corrupts ultimately, and ultimate power really ultimately corrupts everybody and everything it touches. So we know that. And yet God, in His Word, is telling us He has put sinful people in charge. Part of His common grace is to give us a government that keeps basically society moving forward. Okay. 1 Peter chapter 2 helps me a little bit here. So, in regard to the Civil War question, in regard to the Revolutionary War question, those are big issues. But the Civil War was worth fighting to eliminate slavery. I know that's a very simple explanation. There was a lot going on in that war. But there was a reason that it happened. And the reason ultimately was a good thing, even though it was the bloodiest conflict in American history. But there was a good result on the other end. The Revolutionary War was also a good thing. It's complicated. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of things to discuss. Some things are not just, oh, it's easy. Let's just use some common sense. Well, some things are complex. This is, in my opinion, one of the complex issues, is where our submission to government and our submission to God, we want to make sure that we aren't overbalanced in one way or the other. You can never be overbalanced in submission to God. But what I mean is where Christians draw the line in listening or not listening to the governing authority. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. That first few words helps me a lot. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So it is appropriate for us to show honor to people who are in authority. It's appropriate that you treat your boss at work with an appropriate level of deference. And your boss's boss gets probably more deference. The CEO gets more deference. The mayor of Huntington should be honored. The governor of West Virginia should be honored. The president of the United States should be honored and prayed for. Because Timothy tells us to pray for all those who are in authority. So, I struggle here a little bit. I am politically libertarian. I hate the government, okay? I don't trust them at all because of the aforementioned issue of power and corruption, all that. And yet, I am submitted to the Lord Jesus Christ, who tells me to honor them, tells me to pray for them, tells me to pay my taxes, obey the speed limit. Can't believe it's 35 miles an hour through this particular section. It's utterly ridiculous. It's completely arbitrary that somebody came up with the number 35. Because I can drive 55 and everything's fine. Or 65. It's a funny example, but it is an example of what causes societies to be safe in a certain regard on the streets, is that we obey the traffic laws. One of the really interesting things you can do is look at what other countries say about America's traffic laws. And one thing that they do admire America for is everybody, for the most part, unless you're in New York City, for the most part, everybody obeys stop signs and stoplights. Don't you get irritated when you're driving somewhere and there people are not obeying? If I ever come close to committing murder, it is when I am driving, and Jen is shaking her head and praying right now. When we're driving, and I'm telling you, if I see you do this, I will have to repent, but because I will not have happy things. When you're driving in construction, and it says merge left, and then people that are possessed by the devil come up the right-hand side and get over in front, meaning nobody in the back moves forward, and they keep cutting people off, and then I don't know who the people are that let them over, but I am not one of those people, ever, under any circumstance. If you are driving up the right side, as far as I'm concerned, crash into that blinking left arrow and ruin the rest of your day, hopefully, ruin. So obviously I have lots of sanctification left in my life. And you think I'm joking. Jennifer will tell you, I hate that with a ungodly passion. So I shouldn't be laughing. I should be repenting. But we have laws and systems put in place that are meant for the flourishing of society. That's what they're meant for. It's obvious that some of the laws that we have in place are arbitrary and meaningless. It's for the sake of somebody having their name attached to legislation, and it just creates bureaucracy. So, be that as it may, I'm supposed to submit to the governing authorities. I'm supposed to pay my taxes. I'm supposed to show honor to whom honor is due, By the way,